One.
Hey everyone. So these slides that I put together were focused on finding universal design for learning in practice. And so they're a little bit more nuanced though, and I wanted to walk you through how they work because I would imagine it's not going to be one of the DISs always facilitating them. So I wanted to give you an idea of how to facilitate them back at your site. So, with anything that's been universally designed, you should always find a goal. Give educators a process for finding universal design for learning in action at their school sites and within their district. So, this is the goal of this presentation. This is the goal of this data collection process, is to find UDL in action and be able to see whether or not UDL practices are growing over time. The instructions. So how this works. Step one is to calibrate. So within whatever team it is that's going out and collecting data, you need to first calibrate and make sure that you have a shared definition of what you're looking for. Now, I want to stress this because it's so important. And oftentimes when you're in the crunch, you just are all about going out and seeing the practices in action. If you don't calibrate, your data is going to be a mess. It will be a total mess and it will be invalid because people are operating under different definitions of what they're looking for. And so what you want to do is spend a good 15 minutes calibrating. Now, once you've calibrated once or twice as a team and that team stays the same, then maybe you don't need to calibrate as much. But if you have new members or if you are calibrating with different people on a regular basis, you really are walking with different people on a regular basis, you really need to make sure that organizationally you have the same definitions. So from there, once you've calibrated, then you're going to go walk and record and use the tools that I'm about to show you. And then once you've walked and recorded, now you can analyze the data and figure out what is actually happening or try to see what questions that data leads you to. The data is remember, observational data, and you can make some conclusions from it, but really it should lead you to more questions and asking and trying to figure out, well, what are our next steps? How do we determine what is actually causing a growth or a lack in these specific areas of practice? And then it leads well into the application slide or application prompt. What are your next steps? What are you going to do differently? What are you going to do the same? How are you going to share this data in a way that's productive, helpful, and non-threatening? So that's the instructions for how to use it. Now let's talk about the actual kind of nitty-gritty for calibration. So in a minute or in the next slide, there are a series of videos that you can watch. You can also calibrate by going out into a couple classrooms. Just know that those data that those classrooms produce isn't actually valid because you are operating under different definitions. So you're just using it as a real life experience, a way to practice, and then you'd throw out that data and go out and actually gather data based on your shared definitions that you developed because of this activity. So when you calibrate, you first need to determine, well, what are we going to look for as a group? What's our lens going to be in terms of UDL? Now, each of these, there's 5 different options here for 5 different lenses. You have a deep dive, that's all 3 principles. You have a welcome mat, that's just the top guidelines for each principle. You have the engagement only as a focus, you have representation only as a focus, and then you have action expression only as a focus. Now, each of these is a button that you can click. So, for example, here you could click this sheet and it will take you to make a copy, and then you can print this and go out and calibrate 1 sheet per observation. Or you could click this button here and it takes you to a data collection form that you can do that same process, same exact questions, yes and no questions, by the way, but you can do it digitally. The reason why we did yes and no questions is because I want to force you to be objective and to have to make a decision. The caveat to that is that means you have to be okay with no's. You have to be okay with not seeing something and marking as such. So once you've gone out, you've calibrated, then you're going to come back, and this folder is a place for you to gather your results if you did the Google form. The one thing I would ask is, if once you're done with this process, if you could delete your data because it's, again, not valid, and that frees up those forms for the next round of people who want to use them to calibrate off of. So your practice observation, you can, again, like I said in the previous slide, you can practice doing it in real life, which honestly, I think is the most authentic and best way. But let's say you're sitting at a district office and you don't have the ability to go out or the time to go out. Then here are several videos that you can pull from that would allow you to do an experience where you calibrate based on a video. So here are the steps. Watch this video and record what you see. Don't talk to each other. Don't argue yet. There's plenty of time to argue, but that will be coming up. You're going to want to make sure that you come to your own conclusions and be willing and ready to have a defensible argument for why you came to your conclusions. At the end, compare your results with the other observers. Now, at this point, you're not having the conversation per se of why. You're just showing, here's what I said. And where there's agreement, so where you have like everybody in the room said yes, you don't really need to spend a ton of time there. You might visit the question, have a quick share of, okay, why did you say yes? Why did you say yes? But for the most part, you can see that we are saying and seeing the same things. It's where there's disagreement in this calibration process. Remember, we're trying to all look for UDL and have the same definitions for what we're seeing when it comes to UDL. So where you see like less than 80% agreement or even 90% agreement, that becomes a question that you need to pause on and entertain the conversation for. So what that means is if you have a person that marked, yes, I did see multiple representations of the concept, and then you have a person that marked, no, I did not see multiple representations of the concept, you need to have a conversation. You need to talk to each other and say, well, here's why I selected no here. And then that other person shares, here's why I selected yes. And from there, the group needs to decide using maybe a fist of 5 or something like that, 5 being we agree, 1 being we don't agree. Well, which definition are we going to move off of? Which one makes the most sense? The definitions from my standpoint and my lens that make the most sense are the ones that are completely objective, where it's based solely on what you see, where there's not an inference happening at all. It's just based on the data of what we see, and also based on what we see and how it relates to the goal, right? Like sometimes we see teachers doing multiple representations and it's just them moving through a book, and the book itself has the pictures or has the text, and maybe that works, but where it disconnects from the goal, where it doesn't reinforce the goal, then it's not actually a valid representation. And apply that same value to any of the other principles. And this process may take a little bit of time. It may be really fast. The reality is the more you pour into it, the better it will be and the faster it will get over time. And so in my mind, the most efficient way to do something is to do it right and thorough the first time. And so the more effort you can put into this calibration process the first time, the better it's going to be, and the more clean and clear your data will be. All right, so enough about that. That's the process for calibration. Once you've calibrated, you need to not do these forms anymore. You need to download and create your own forms that are for you. So on this slide here, it's towards the end. These forms are each clickable and they allow you to make a copy. So now, like the way a Google form works is that if everyone has the same form, then all the data is going to collapse into that one space. Whereas if one single school site wants their own data, then making a copy of it allows for them to have their own data that only they can see, only the people that calibrated can see. And so as a facilitator, you'll want to keep that in mind. I don't oftentimes I like to have that pre-planned and pre-prepared so that when I'm in the moment leading people through the calibration process, they aren't scrambling. We're not scrambling to build the form as we go. It's already been prepared and ready. Okay, so you have your own form, you have your own process that's all about your context and your people. Now go out and walk and record. This is another representation. This icon is to remind you that, like, for the data to be clean, you really need to be okay with marking no's. Like, don't take it as a threat to you, the value of your system, the value of your organization. I'll show you a slide in a minute that helps reinforce that. So be okay with no's. And then also do not infer, meaning like, okay, we just walked in. I know this teacher. I know that we just missed their learning objective, or we just missed this great hook that they always do. No, like if you didn't see it, be okay marking no. And be consistent with the amount of time you spend in each classroom. You shouldn't spend like 5 minutes in the first class, 10 minutes in the second, 7 minutes in the third. in order for your data to be clear, the more consistent you can be in terms of your time and your allotments, the more valid the data becomes, especially as you develop it and grab it over time. So from there, once you've gone out and walked, let's say you've walked 5 classrooms, now you have a series of data that's really raw. It's quantitative and raw, and you're going to want to bring that back and analyze it and determine what does this mean? What trends did we see in the data? What specific evidence did we see that supports these trends? What questions do these data bring to mind? So when you're analyzing the data, it should bring some conclusions about here's where we're at as an organization. But it also should bring up all sorts of questions. Here's what we need to go analyze. Here's the things we need to go figure out. Here's the PD that we need to ask and determine if it'll be helpful, or if it was helpful or fruitful or not. So being willing to ask questions and be objective with what the data says. The power of this process is to do it over time. So, for example, if you do it as a one and done, and then show it to your staff or people, it's really going to be threatening and scary, because it's like, okay, well, that was our shot, and it was on a 5-minute window, and I don't even remember what that necessarily was. So using it as a once and done is not as effective as using it consistently over time. It's going to give you organizational calibration on what you're looking for, because that's a big question everyone asks when they're talking about UDL. What are we looking for? Well, this allows you to calibrate, and as an organization, develop that shared definition within your leadership and within your stakeholders. Like, you should be bringing teachers along board in this. You should be bringing parents along board. Heck, do it with students. Why not? You might have to make it more accessible, but then I'm sure it'll get better. So, and then doing it over time. So after 30 walks, here's where our data was. Now, after 90 walks, here's where our data is. And after 300 walks, here's where our data is. So obviously, as an organization, we need to celebrate growth. And even if it's slow and steady incremental growth, it's still growth. And it allows us to really create a safe space to say, yeah, like 10% of the time we marked yes to that. But now after 90, now we're seeing it 17% of the time. It just makes it really accessible, non-threatening, and open. And the other thing, just as kind of a way to keep the data non-threatening, I don't ever, like in the forms, I intentionally didn't put any space for teachers' names or anything that would create a marker that would then create kind of a threat to a teacher. Because the reality is, it's not about an individual person, it's about an organization, and the organization owning their data without a face, if that makes sense. Because then it's not an I got you, it's just a diagnostic of here's where we're at, here's how we're growing, here's the areas that we may be regressing in, and here are some things that we as an organization, as a community, here's just some things we're going to do as a result of it. So now we get to that step. Once we have the data, we can see it. Now we can apply it. So what are you going to go out and answer? What questions are you going to answer? What are you going to do differently? How are you going to communicate this to stakeholders in a way that empowers them to say, oh, like, here's where we're at, and here are some things that we can now design towards or change. So take this practice back to your sites. Again, this form here is the one that makes everything downloadable so that you can quickly download it and make it your own. If you download it or make a copy of something, just as a reminder of how Google works, it then becomes yours. So it's not something that, like even I put this presentation together, it's not something that I would see or have any access to. So it can be completely yours, and you can own it both from your site level and at a district level. So that's how this form works. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And these back kind of forms here are just extra icons. And this one gave like kind of an example key from one of the lesson videos. Thanks a lot. And